In the heart of frozen Moscow, beneath the echoing bells of the Kremlin, one man ruled with a hand that both built and bled an empire. They called him Ivan the Terrible, a name carved into the bones of history, whispered by priests and feared by kings. He was the first Tsar of all Russia, and perhaps its first monster. A man who dreamed of divine justice, but drowned it in rivers of his own making. A ruler who saw himself as God's chosen hand, until the mirror of his own guilt shattered his soul. Before Stalin, before the tyrants of modern age, there was Ivan, the boy who became a god, and then a ghost haunted by the blood of his people. This is not just the story of a king, it's the anatomy of power itself. Stay with us as we journey into the icy heart of Russia's most feared ruler. If you love exploring the dark side of history, like, share, and subscribe, because the past still breathes, and tonight, it remembers Ivan the Terrible. The wind howled across Moscow like a choir of ghosts. Snow fell not as flakes, but as ashes, soft, weightless remnants of a kingdom that had burned itself in the name of faith. At the center of the frozen city, the Kremlin loomed, its towers piercing the pale sky, its domes glinting like the eyes of forgotten saints. Inside, the Tsar sat alone. Ivan IV the Terrible rested on a throne carved from black oak and gold. His crown glimmered under the candlelight, a twisted halo forged by fear. In one hand, he held the orb of his empire. In the other, a silver cross, slick with dried blood. The air was thick with incense, yet beneath the sweet smoke lingered the iron scent of centuries. He breathed slowly. Every exhale rose like a prayer too heavy to reach heaven. Before him lay the remnants of his life, scrolls of decrees, letters from priests, a cracked mirror that reflected not the ruler of Russia but the ruin of a man. The candles trembled in their brass holders. Shadows stretched long, twisting across the walls like black serpents. Beyond the thick walls, Moscow slept beneath the snow, unaware that its Tsar was dying. He closed his eyes, and the past began to rise not as memory, but as judgment. The child he once was appeared first small, frightened, cowering in a cold chamber. Ivan's father had died when he was only 3, leaving the throne to a boy and the vultures who circled it. The boyar's proud, cruel nobles ruled the palace in his name. They fed on his inheritance and his fear. He remembered their laughter not as sound, but as a feeling that scraped bone. They had taken everything, even his childhood. He had learned early that mercy was weakness. And so, he built walls not of stone, but of silence. As he grew, he began to watch. He studied the men who beat him, the priests who blessed them, and the courtiers who smiled as the world turned cold. By 10, he knew how to pray. By 12, he knew how to hate. The image of the child faded, replaced by the boy who would crown himself Tsar. At 16, he walked into the cathedral of the Dormition, beneath the soaring arches of Moscow's Holy Heart. Snow fell through the open doors as priests chanted, their voices trembling like the wind. The golden crown of Monomach, symbol of divine right, was lowered onto his head. For the first time, Russia had a Tsar, not a prince, not a puppet. The boy became a god in the eyes of his people. But in his own eyes, he was something far more dangerous. He was a boy who had been given permission to avenge himself. And vengeance, in the hands of a believer, is a sacred fire. The scene shifted. The throne room flickered between time from the young Tsar of promise to the monarch of dread. He saw the fields of Kazan, burning beneath the banners of his army. He saw the black smoke rise to heaven, and believed that God had answered him. He saw himself kneeling in the ashes, thanking the Almighty for victory while the corpses of thousands cooled at his feet. In the beginning, he had fought for order. But the longer he ruled, the more the line between justice and wrath disappeared. Every rebellion felt like betrayal. Every doubt, a wound. And so, he built a new kind of faith, one that worshipped obedience and feared forgiveness. He became both the shepherd and the wolf. Now, years later, sitting alone beneath the flickering light of his own guilt, Ivan could still hear the whispers of those he had silenced. Their voices bled through the walls, the cries of Novgorod, the weeping of mothers, the laughter of the dead. Each one called his name, as if summoning him to a court beyond the mortal. The Tsar opened his eyes. His hand shook. He pressed the cross to his forehead once, twice, as if to seal his own absolution. But there was no warmth in the touch of God tonight. He had built Russia from blood and fear. He had united her lands, crushed her enemies, built cathedrals that pierced the clouds, yet none of it could drown the silence inside his heart. The room seemed to grow colder. The shadows gathered behind him, forming shapes that were once men, once sons, once friends. Their faces blurred into one, the face of Anastasia, his beloved, the only one who had ever seen the frightened boy behind the crown. Her eyes were calm, forgiving, unreachable. He reached out, but she was made of light, and his hands were made of sin. The vision dissolved, leaving only the trembling candles and the slow, heavy rhythm of his breath. Outside, the Kremlin bells began to toll midnight. Each toll rolled through the city like thunder trapped in stone. Snow covered the rooftops, muffling the world, turning Moscow into a tomb of ice. The Tsar leaned back on his throne. The crown slipped slightly, tilting like the balance of his own soul. He thought of the empire he would leave behind, vast, terrified, magnificent. He thought of the faith he had forged from fire and fear. He thought of the son he had buried by his own hand. In the silence, he finally whispered to himself, not in words, but in thought. They will remember the Tsar, but will they remember the man? The candles dimmed. The snow outside thickened, and as the wind roared through the empty halls of the Kremlin, the great Ivan the Terrible bowed his head not to God, but to the weight of his own creation. For even kings must kneel before their sins. The throne room faded into black. The cross slipped from his hand, and in that final fall of light and shadow, Russia's most powerful man became its most haunted ghost. Snow fell on Moscow like the ashes of forgotten saints. Within the fortress walls of the Kremlin, the cradle of a child trembled under the weight of silence. Ivan, son of Vasily III, heir to the Grand Principality of Moscow, was born not into peace but into suspicion. His father's death came swiftly, like a candle snuffed by invisible hands. Power shifted in whispers, in the creak of doors, in the thin breath of courtiers who measured loyalty by survival. When Vasily's body turned cold, the court turned colder. A child too young to rule became a prize for men who served no one but their own greed. The boyars' noble families, who called themselves guardians of Russia, fed upon the kingdom like wolves circling a wounded stag. And in the center of their feast sat a boy with eyes too old for his years. The Tsarina, Elena Glinskaya, tried to hold the throne in her son's name, but the court around her was poison. At night, she walked the halls clutching the child, whispering prayers to saints who had long since stopped listening. One morning, she didn't wake. The silver chalice on her table still smelled faintly of honey and death. Ivan was 8 when he learned what fear truly was not the fear of monsters, but of men who smile while sharpening their knives. In the grand chambers of the Kremlin, he wandered like a ghost among predators. The boyars fought for power openly now. They dragged his tutors away, beat his servants in front of him, and seized the crown's treasures for their own. The child who was meant to be Tsar was left to starve in a palace built of marble and betrayal. He watched as they stole his mother's jewels, tore her banners from the walls, and cursed her memory. No one looked at him. No one bowed. The boy who should have ruled all of Russia was invisible until he became useful. The winters in Moscow were long and merciless. The walls of the Kremlin seemed to grow colder with every passing year, the corridors darker. Ivan learned to hide his hunger and his tears. He learned silence, how to vanish into the corners of a room, how to listen to secrets meant for older ears. Each insult was a lesson, each slap a seed of memory. One evening, while snow clawed at the windows, he watched a boyar's guard beat a servant nearly to death for spilling wine. Ivan stood at the door, his small hands trembling not from pity, but from something far deeper, fascination. The sound of power, The rhythm of cruelty, it echoed in him like a hymn. In that moment, fear became something else. It became knowledge. And knowledge, in the hands of a wounded child, is the beginning of tyranny. In the following years, the boy who was once pitied began to observe with the stillness of a serpent. He watched the boyars dine, laugh, and conspire. He memorized every name, every insult, every betrayal. At night he spoke to no one, but in his silence grew a voice that whispered only to him, soft, cold, relentless. It told him that mercy was weakness, that love was poison, that God himself demanded strength paid in blood. When he turned 12, he began to change. The trembling boy became something sharper, quieter, harder to read. The servants whispered that his eyes reflected fire even when no candles burned. He began to test his newfound authority in small ways, ordering beatings for those who crossed him, watching with detached curiosity as pain unfolded. No one dared confront him. No one dared stop him. The wolves that once surrounded the child now sensed the birth of another predator. Outside, Moscow's bells tolled for the Feast of the Epiphany, echoing through streets buried in snow. Inside the Kremlin, Ivan walked alone through the grand hall, where portraits of dead princes stared down from cracked walls. Each face seemed to ask him who he would become. And deep inside, he already knew. He knelt before the altar, the candlelight trembling over his young face. His lips moved not in prayer, but in something far older and darker. A promise. He would never be helpless again. He would never kneel before men who called themselves noble. The world would kneel before him or burn. The years crawled forward. The boy became a youth gaunt, silent, and unreadable. He no longer flinched when the boyars mocked him, nor when they cursed his mother's name. He smiled instead, a thin, unsettling smile that made even his enemies turn away. Those who had beaten him now sought to avoid his gaze, because in that gaze they saw not forgiveness but memory. And memory, for Ivan, was sharper than any blade. The great towers of Moscow cast long shadows across the frozen city. Peasants trudged through snow with their heads bowed, whispering prayers for a ruler they no longer saw. But in the high rooms of the Kremlin, something ancient was awakening, a will born of humiliation, wrapped in faith, tempered by rage. He was not yet Tsar, but already he understood the secret of power, that fear is a throne invisible, yet stronger than any crown. As the last snow of winter fell, Ivan stood at the window, his breath fogging the glass. Outside, the bells of Moscow tolled for another dead nobleman, another shadow gone from the world. He didn't smile, but somewhere within him, something loosened. The balance of power was shifting. Soon, he would no longer be the child of fear. He would become its master. The boy turned away from the window. The candle on his desk flickered, casting a halo of light across his face. In that fragile glow, his eyes looked almost divine and entirely merciless. The winter of 1543 came like a silent siege. The Kremlin walls glistened beneath sheets of ice. The domes of Moscow dimmed beneath a sunless sky. Within those walls, the boy who had once cowered in corners now stood at the threshold of something vast and unseen. He was 13, no longer a child, not yet a ruler, but the air around him had begun to shift. Fear had stopped chasing him. Now, it followed him. The boyars still played their game of treachery, still drank from gold chalices while peasants froze in the streets. But among them, a whisper grew, a warning passed like a curse. The boy remembers. They had beaten him, mocked him, starved him, and now, when they met his eyes across the council chamber, they saw not youth, but judgment waiting to be born. That winter, Ivan discovered the pleasure of silence. He would sit at the high table, say nothing, and watch the men who thought themselves masters of Russia squirm beneath his gaze. Every gesture he made, every pause in his breath, became an unspoken threat. He didn't need a crown to command. He had something stronger, the invisible power of dread. The snow outside fell heavier each day, as though the heavens themselves wished to bury the sins of Moscow. But inside the fortress, the rot only deepened. One boyar, Prince Shwisky, had ruled as regent since Ivan's mother's death. Cruel, cunning, and certain of his own safety, Shwisky believed the child too broken to resist him. He was wrong. One night, the young Ivan summoned his few remaining loyal guards. He ordered the doors to the great hall closed and bolted. The torches hissed, casting shadows that stretched like black wings across the stone floor. The boy sat on the throne, his father's throne, for the first time. He said nothing. He didn't need to. When Shwisky entered, the boy's eyes followed him like a predator's. The guards seized the regent before he could speak. A cry echoed through the vaulted chamber, not of pain, but of disbelief. How could a boy command such obedience? Shwisky's body was dragged through the snow before dawn. When the sun rose over Moscow, the city awoke to silence and to fear. The child who had once been powerless had given his first order of death. And in the hollow that followed, Ivan felt something new. Not guilt, not satisfaction, but clarity. Power was no longer a dream. It was real, and it obeyed him. He walked alone through the corridors afterward, past tapestries depicting saints and martyrs. The candlelight danced over their painted eyes, as if they too were forced to watch. Beneath the echo of his own footsteps, he heard something else, the faint rhythm of inevitability. Every tyrant is born twice, once from flesh, once from fear. Ivan's second birth had begun. Over the following months, Moscow changed. Where there had been mockery, now there was trembling respect. Servants bowed lower. Guards moved aside at his passing. And the boyars, those wolves of the court, began to lick his hand instead of baring their teeth. He was not yet crowned Tsar, but already the city moved to his will, as though God himself had shifted the world a little closer to his favor. The boy began to ride through the city again, cloaked in fur, his young face pale against the bitter wind. Peasants crossed themselves when they saw him. They did not know why, only that something sacred and terrible lived behind those eyes. The story spread, that he spoke to no one, that he slept little, that he prayed for hours before icons until his knees bled. The people called him blessed. The court called him cursed. Both were right. The hunger that had once gnawed at him as a child had changed shape. It was no longer the hunger of the body, but of dominion. He began to read the scriptures not for comfort, but for justification. He found in their words the reflection of his own destiny, kings chosen by God, prophets who wielded wrath as righteousness. He did not see the warnings. He saw permission. In his solitude, he began to believe that his suffering had been divine preparation, that his pain was proof of his right to rule. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, he would walk through the empty halls of the palace, trailing his fingers along the cold stone. He would stop where his mother once prayed, where her voice once soothed him, and for a heartbeat, the mask would slip, the boy would return, frightened, alone. Then the wind would howl through the cracks in the walls, and the moment would die. Compassion, he told himself, was the language of the weak. He could not afford to speak it anymore. The winter broke, but its shadow did not. By the spring of his 16th year, Ivan had grown into something no one had expected. Tall, sharp-boned, quiet, with the presence of a saint and the gaze of a serpent. The boyars whispered of arranging a council to decide his coronation. He listened, nodded, and agreed, but in his heart, the decision had already been made. The night before the ceremony, he walked to the Kremlin's highest tower. Below him stretched the city, endless rooftops, frozen rivers, and the faint orange glow of hearths flickering in the distance. He watched the smoke rise and imagined it was incense rising to heaven, carrying his name. The city did not know it yet, but by dawn it would kneel. He closed his eyes and remembered every moment of humiliation, the hunger, the beatings, the laughter. He let them play across his mind like a litany of the damned, and then he forgave none of it. He made of it a weapon, a blade forged in memory, sharpened in silence. When morning came, he would no longer be the child of fear. He would be the god of it. The bells began to toll below, slow, solemn, eternal. Moscow stirred. The city's breath hung heavy in the dawn light as Ivan descended the tower steps, one measured stride at a time. The crown of Russia waited for him in the cathedral, a relic of gold and suffering. But even before it touched his head, the people would already know. Fear had found its king. Mourning broke over Moscow like the breath of eternity. A thin mist curled above the domes of cathedrals, where gold and frost mingled on the crosses that pierced the pale sky. Beneath them, thousands of peasants crowded the frozen courtyards, their faces lifted toward the Kremlin, waiting for the boy who would become their god. They had come from every corner of Rus, from the black forests of Suzdal, from the white plains of Vladimir, from the icy banks of the Volga, drawn by rumor, by faith, by fear. The bells began to toll. Slow, thunderous, endless. Each chime seemed to shake the bones of the earth, as if even the stones of Moscow knew they were witnessing the birth of something terrible and divine. Inside the cathedral of the Dormition, the air shimmered with incense. Priests in golden vestments chanted in Old Church Slavonic, their voices rising and falling like waves. The altar gleamed not with light, but with history. Here, princes had knelt for blessings, but none had ever dared to call themselves Tsar. Not until now. The boy stood at the threshold of the cathedral, clad in robes heavy with jewels, his face pale, his eyes unreadable. 16 winters had carved more scars into his soul than most men bore in a lifetime. As the priests bowed, Ivan's gaze lifted to the ceiling where angels painted in faded colors seemed to watch from another world. He wondered if they pitied him, or if they too were afraid. The patriarch approached, bearing the ancient monomach's cap, a crown brought from Byzantium centuries before, said to hold the breath of empire within its fur and gold. The moment it touched Ivan's head, the air seemed to shudder. The incense stilled, the chanting faltered, and for one eternal heartbeat, the boy and the crown were one. A roar rose from the city outside, not of joy, but of awe. The peasants fell to their knees as if struck by an unseen wind. From the towers, the banners of Street George unfurled, snapping in the cold. The first Tsar of all Russia had risen. Ivan did not smile. His lips moved, but not in prayer. Those close enough to see his eyes swore later they had glimpsed something beyond human, a calm so absolute it bordered on divine madness. For the first time in history, the ruler of Moscow no longer bowed to princes, popes, or kings. He bowed only to God, and in his heart, he believed God had chosen him alone. The ceremony lasted for hours, but Ivan barely felt the passage of time. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon him, and beneath that, the pulse of something darker, the echo of every humiliation he had ever endured, now transformed into power. The boy who had once been starved, beaten, and mocked now wore the world's heaviest crown. And it fit perfectly. As the choir's final note faded, he rose from his knees and turned toward the doors. Outside, the crowd surged like an ocean of faith. Peasants clutched icons, nobles crossed themselves, soldiers saluted with trembling hands. Ivan stepped into the sunlight, and for a moment, it seemed the sky itself bowed before him. The people saw a savior. The boyars saw a weapon they could no longer control. And Ivan, he saw nothing but destiny stretching before him, cold and absolute. That night, Moscow did not sleep. Bonfires burned along the riverbanks. Bells rang from every tower. The city celebrated its Tsar, unaware that it had just crowned its own shadow. For beneath the gold and the prayers, Ivan's heart whispered with the memory of his childhood cellars, the smell of rot, the echo of laughter that had mocked him. Power had not healed him. It had only given his wounds a throne. He walked alone through the palace corridors long after the revelry had faded. Candles guttered against the stone, throwing his reflection across the walls. Each flicker of light became a phantom, his father, his mother, his enemies, himself. The silence pressed close, familiar, almost comforting. In it, Ivan found what he had always sought: control. For the first time, he could command even silence to obey him. He stood before the mirror in his chamber, the crown still upon his head. It gleamed like captured fire. He studied the reflection not as a man studies himself, but as a god studies creation. The line between the two was vanishing. He thought of the scriptures again, of David, chosen by God, of Constantine, builder of empires. He imagined their ghosts standing behind him, approving. In the glass, he saw them kneel. He saw them vanish. Only he remained. Outside, snow began to fall, gentle, ceaseless, white as forgiveness. But no forgiveness would ever reach him now. Every flake that touched the earth seemed to whisper a new name for him, one he would one day earn in full: Grozny, the Terrible. Before dawn, Ivan ordered his first decree as Tsar. Church and crown would be united under his will. No noble would rule without his consent. The word of the Tsar would be the voice of God. It was not a proclamation of rule. It was a declaration of faith, faith in himself. He believed Russia had slept too long in the hands of petty men. He would wake it. He would forge it in fear and obedience until it gleamed like the sword of an angel. And if blood was the price of salvation, then so be it. He had paid worse before. By sunrise, the city lay quiet again. The fires had died. The bells had gone still. Only the crown gleamed faintly in the half-light, heavy with promise, heavier with sin. Ivan sat upon the throne, unmoving, watching the first light of morning creep across the marble floor toward his feet. When it reached his hands, he did not move them. He only watched, as though waiting for the light to bleed red. Winter deepened across Russia, and with it, the silence of submission. In the palaces of the boyars, the laughter had grown thin. The same men who once mocked the orphan prince now bowed to the young Tsar with trembling hands. Fear had become the new language of loyalty. From the high windows of the Kremlin, Ivan watched the city below him as if it were an ant farm built of stone and frost. He saw peasants trudging through snow with bowed heads. He saw soldiers drilling in courtyards that had once been filled with nobles' feasts. He saw priests lifting their hands toward heaven and wondered whether they prayed for his soul or for their own survival. The coronation had crowned more than a ruler. It had birthed a creed. Ivan believed the Tsar was not chosen by God. He was God's reflection on earth. Every act of mercy or cruelty was sanctified by this conviction. In the echoing chambers of the Kremlin, this faith hardened into doctrine. He began to reform his realm with the precision of a surgeon who had forgotten the difference between flesh and stone. He ordered new courts of justice, yet filled them with men whose loyalty outweighed their honesty. He restructured the army, granting lands to common soldiers and stripping privileges from the ancient families that had once humiliated him. To the people, he was a savior, young, intelligent, unyielding. To the boyars, he was the execution of their own arrogance made flesh. Every decree bore his seal. The double-headed eagle of Russia, wings spread wide, eyes staring east and west. It was more than a symbol. It was a warning. Russia would never again be torn apart by divided loyalties. There would be only one throne, one will, one God, and all three would speak with the same voice. Ivan built libraries, filled with scriptures and chronicles, demanding that history remember him as the restorer of order. He invited foreign scholars to Moscow, not out of curiosity, but out of conquest. Knowledge was another land to be taken. He built cathedrals that gleamed with gold while the countryside starved. He saw in every act of creation a monument to himself, and in every moment of peace, a sign of weakness. The people adored him. When he rode through the streets, mothers lifted their children to see him. Some cried that the Tsar had been sent by God. Others whispered that he was God. Ivan heard both, and corrected neither. But power, once awakened, does not sleep quietly. In the shadows of the court, the boyars plotted as they always had. Whispers traveled faster than snowstorms, that the young Tsar was untested, that his faith was fever, that he could still be guided or broken. Each whisper fed the fire already burning in Ivan's chest. He began to see rebellion everywhere, in glances, in silences, in the way a servant's hand trembled when pouring wine. He started to read guilt in the eyes of the innocent. Trust became a luxury he could no longer afford. Even as he prayed, he felt the throne beneath him pulse like a living thing, whispering that every throne demands a sacrifice. The first came quietly. A boyar accused of theft was tried, condemned, and executed. No one mourned him. Few even knew his name. But Ivan watched the blade fall, and something inside him, something fragile, human, did not flinch. For the first time, he felt peace in punishment. Justice, he told himself, was not cruelty when done in God's name. After that, Moscow began to change. The air seemed thicker, the silence heavier. Nobles smiled wider, bowed lower, but their eyes betrayed terror. Church bells no longer called, only to prayer they tolled like warnings. Even the snow seemed reluctant to fall upon the Kremlin, as though the heavens feared to touch what lay beneath. And still, Ivan prayed. Every morning, before the altar in his private chapel, he knelt among flickering candles. But his prayers were no longer pleas for guidance. They were oaths. He prayed not to be forgiven, but to be obeyed. Not for mercy, but for dominion. The lines between holiness and tyranny began to blur. The scriptures he once read for comfort became weapons in his mind. Every verse about divine judgment became a reflection of himself. He saw no contradiction between faith and fear. He believed they were the same flame, illuminating the same truth, that salvation required terror. Beyond Moscow's walls, famine struck. Villages burned from raids on the steppe. And yet, the Tsar's proclamations thundered with visions of divine empire. He spoke of a Russia that would stretch from the Baltic to the Urals, of a faith that would conquer not with swords but with submission. The priests echoed his words. The people obeyed. Fear had become faith. In his private chambers, Ivan began to dream of Kazan, a city far to the east, a stronghold of resistance. He saw it in his visions, wrapped in smoke and lightning. He imagined its walls falling before his armies, its mosques turned to cathedrals, its rivers running red. To the world, it was strategy. To Ivan, it was prophecy. He ordered maps drawn, armies trained, weapons forged. Every clang of the blacksmith's hammer was a psalm. Every drop of sweat in the training fields was an offering. He walked among his soldiers like a priest among worshippers. And they, too, believed. For if their Tsar was chosen by God, then war was holy. As winter thawed into spring, the city prepared for conquest. New banners were woven black with silver crosses, symbols of divine fire. The smell of pitch and steel replaced the scent of incense. And above all of it, the golden domes of Moscow gleamed like eyes watching the birth of destiny. On the eve of departure, Ivan stood once more before his mirror. The candlelight shimmered across the crown, now dulled with wear. He thought of his mother's face, her eyes fading as poison took her, and wondered if she would recognize him now. Would she see the boy who once trembled in the dark, or the god he had become? He touched the cold glass, and for a moment, the reflection seemed to reach back. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, though no storm had yet formed. It was as if the sky itself sensed what was coming. Moscow slept beneath the omen, unaware that its Tsar would soon baptize Russia not in holy water but in blood. Spring arrived over Moscow like a hesitant forgiveness. For the first time in years, the city smelled not of smoke but of thawing earth and rain. Church bells no longer rang as warnings, but as hymns of renewal. And within the towering Kremlin walls, the Tsar, still young, still capable of wonder, found something unexpected: peace. Her name was Anastasia Romanovna, daughter of nobility, born not to conquer but to soothe. She moved through the court like sunlight crossing marble floors, gentle, silent, yet impossible to ignore. Where Ivan's presence silenced rooms, hers invited breath back into them. The courtiers, accustomed to fear, began to speak softly again, as though her voice had tempered the air itself. Ivan saw her first not as a subject, but as a reprieve. A life lived too long in suspicion had turned every glance into a weapon, every smile into deceit. But in Anastasia's presence, the tremor in his spirit stilled. Her gaze carried no hunger for power, no fear of him, only a quiet faith that even monsters could remember how to be men. Under her influence, Moscow changed once more. The executions slowed, the whispers softened. The Oprichnina, those dark riders of the future, had not yet been born. Instead, the Kremlin echoed with music, with the laughter of children, with the prayers of citizens who dared to hope again. For a fleeting moment, the empire exhaled. Ivan, the Tsar who had believed himself divine, began to believe in something more dangerous: love. He walked through gardens newly planted by her command, orchards of cherry and birch, symbols of peace in Russian lore. He ordered books to be copied, schools to be founded, monasteries rebuilt, trade routes reopened. The Volga carried grain instead of ash. It was as though the specter of his childhood had been exorcised by her touch. But love, like peace, is fragile in the hands of kings. And every paradise built upon power carries the scent of its own ruin. As years passed, the two became inseparable, ruler and queen, soul and anchor. Foreign ambassadors wrote home of a Tsar transformed, a monarch of strange piety and restraint. He listened to the counsel of his wife more than his generals, and her voice, calm, deliberate, merciful, kept him human. When he stood before the people, she stood beside him. When he entered the cathedral, she was the quiet shadow at his side. And though his heart still bore scars from his youth, Anastasia's love filled the cracks with something like light. For the first time, Ivan dreamed not of conquest, but of legacy. He envisioned a Russia united not by fear, but by faith. He saw himself not as the hand of God's wrath, but as the shepherd of his kingdom. And in those rare nights of peace, when snow fell softly beyond the palace windows, he could almost believe that redemption was possible. Yet even in light, darkness lingers. It waits not as an enemy, but as a memory that refuses to die. And within the boy who had once slept among assassins, that memory still whispered. It told him that peace was weakness, that love was illusion, that trust was the first step toward betrayal. He tried to silence it with prayer. He built chapels, donated to the poor, commissioned icons of saints whose faces glowed with compassion. But no matter how bright the candles burned, they could not dispel the shadow at the edge of his thoughts. Because Ivan the Terrible, though not yet terrible, had learned one truth too early. Everything that is beautiful must one day be taken. Years of joy passed like a single breath. Then came the fever. At first, it was dismissed as exhaustion. The physicians offered herbs, prayers, and silence. But soon, Anastasia's light began to fade. Her laughter, once the sound of life returning to the Kremlin, weakened into echoes. Her gardens wilted as though they, too, felt her departure. Ivan prayed not as Tsar, not as ruler, but as the broken child he had once been. He offered gold, relics, even his own salvation, if it would keep her alive. But no kingdom can bargain with death, and no power divine or mortal answers prayers made too late. When Anastasia Romanovna finally closed her eyes, the sun over Moscow dimmed, as though the heavens themselves grieved. The bells tolled for days. Crowds gathered before the palace, weeping for the queen who had brought them mercy. Yet inside the Kremlin, another transformation began, one that would reshape history itself. Ivan sat by her still body, surrounded by silence. He watched the last warmth drain from her hands and knew, with a clarity sharper than any blade, that the world had turned against him again. The same poison that had taken his mother, he believed, had now taken his wife. In that single moment, love became grief and grief became rage. He rose from his knees, a different man. The kind voice within him, Anastasia's voice, was gone. In its place came the old whisper, the one born of fear and solitude. It spoke not of faith, but of retribution. It reminded him of every slight, every betrayal, every noble smile that hid a dagger. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Each flake landed softly, silently, like the beginning of an avalanche. The bells had long stopped ringing, but their echo still haunted the Kremlin. For weeks, Moscow breathed in mourning. The streets lay quiet, the markets empty. Even the river seemed to move slower, as though burdened by grief. But within the Tsar's palace, a silence of another kind took hold, one not of sorrow, but of transformation. Ivan did not leave his chambers for days. The priests came with their psalms, the boyars with their condolences, yet none were permitted beyond the threshold. He sat beside Anastasia's empty bed, the sheets still faintly scented of lavender and loss. Candles burned until they wept wax upon the floor, their flames flickering like the pulse of a dying faith. They say a man's heart breaks once, but a tyrant's heart, if it ever learns to love, shatters into pieces too sharp to mend. When Ivan finally emerged, his eyes no longer held the softness of the man she had known. They were hollow, gleaming not with tears, but with purpose. A new voice had taken root inside him, dark and unrelenting. Someone must pay. He ordered an inquest into her death. Physicians were questioned, servants beaten, and boyars summoned in chains. Each denial, each protest of innocence, only deepened his conviction that poison had stolen his queen. And as the interrogations turned to executions, Moscow realized that its season of mercy had ended. The gardens Anastasia had planted began to wither. The birds that once sang in their branches fled to the forests beyond the city. Even the sky over the Kremlin seemed to darken, as though mourning had become permanent. In the palace halls, portraits were draped in black cloth. Banquets ceased, laughter became treason. And Ivan, once radiant with her love, now walked like a man chased by ghosts. At night, he dreamed of her voice. It came through the cold corridors of his mind, pleading for him to stop. But grief had transformed into obsession. He no longer prayed for her soul, he demanded justice for it. Every noble he had ever distrusted became a suspect. Every whisper became a conspiracy. And in the mirror, he no longer saw the husband who had held her hand. He saw the orphan, trembling before a world that had stolen everything good from him. So he turned to God, not as a supplicant, but as an accuser. He prayed not for salvation, but for vengeance sanctified. He demanded signs. He fasted, scourged himself, offered his crown to the altar, yet the heavens remained silent. In that silence, he found his answer. If God will not punish them, then I will. That was the night he donned black. No longer the radiant Tsar of Moscow, but a shadow crowned in faith and fury. He ordered the forging of new insignias, dogs' heads and brooms, symbols of divine cleansing. The men who bore them would be his chosen, his executioners, his angels. From the ashes of loss, the Oprichnina was conceived, not yet born, but already breathing. Ivan's love for his people decayed into suspicion. His vision of a holy empire transformed into a crusade of purification. Every smile became deceit, every act of kindness a trap. He began to speak of himself as both king and priest, warrior and savior. He built cathedrals even as he planned massacres. He kissed the cross before signing death warrants. His faith was no longer devotion, it was weaponized guilt, twisted into armor. Winter returned to Moscow early that year. Snow fell heavy on the Kremlin roofs, muffling the sound of horses that carried bodies to the frozen earth. And through it all, Ivan remained calm. To him, it was not cruelty, it was purification, necessary and sacred. Each execution was an offering, each scream a hymn. He watched them burn, hang, drown, and whispered her name like a prayer between flames. In his mind, the smoke carried her spirit upward. In truth, it was carrying away what little humanity he had left. Historians would one day write of madness, of paranoia. But in that moment, it was simpler than that. Ivan loved too deeply to let go, and in his attempt to preserve her memory, he destroyed the world she had loved. The palace that once glowed with celebration became a mausoleum. The throne room echoed with emptiness. Even the icons on the walls seemed to avert their gaze. Only the sound of Ivan's footsteps remained steady, deliberate, echoing like a heartbeat through marble halls. One night, he returned to the garden she had built. The snow had covered everything, the fountains, the roses, the stone paths she used to walk. He knelt in the center, where she once stood to bless the spring blossoms. His breath rose in white clouds before him, dissolving into the night air. And there, surrounded by death and silence, he whispered to the wind, not in words, but in thought, "You took her from me. I will take everything from you." The next morning, the orders were written. Cities to purge, families to erase. The dawn of the Oprichnina had begun, and as the black riders prepared their horses, the Tsar stood at his window, watching the first light rise over a city that would never see peace again. He placed his hand upon the frozen glass as if touching the ghost of a reflection. Behind him, the shadow of the cross stretched across the wall, long, dark, unbroken. The year had turned cold again when Ivan's banners darkened the horizon. From the frozen steppes came the thunder of hooves, endless lines of riders, their armor glinting like shards of ice beneath a sun that refused to warm them. At their head rode the Tsar, wrapped in furs black as midnight, the Orthodox cross swaying against his chest. Behind him stretched an empire that had forgotten how to breathe. They said it was God's will that Kazan, the Tatar stronghold of the Volga, must fall. To Ivan, it was not conquest. It was purification. He would cleanse the East in holy fire and prove to heaven that Russia's faith was unbroken. His army was not a mere host of men. It was the will of a wounded soul seeking redemption through destruction. The snowstorm of banners stretched across the plain, each one marked with symbols of the new order. A dog's head for loyalty, a broom for divine cleansing. The Oprichnina, born from grief, now rode as priests of retribution. Their chants mixed with the howling wind, a grim symphony echoing through the valleys. Before them stood Kazan, its towers rising above the mist, its walls ancient and defiant. Smoke drifted from the city's hearths, unaware that it would soon blend with fire and blood. The frozen river beside it was silent, a mirror to the storm of faith about to break. Ivan's army encamped in a vast crescent around the city. Fires burned through the night, thousands of small suns glowing upon the snow. From the Kremlin to the Volga, his rule had become a religion, and this siege its sacred ritual. Each soldier carried not only a sword but a cross, symbols of salvation, turned into weapons of conquest. The priests walked among the tents, blessing the catapults and cannons, sprinkling them with holy water. To them, every stone launched, every arrow loosed, was a prayer, an offering of smoke and death to the divine. And Ivan, watching from his command tent, felt the strange peace of purpose. He believed he was no longer a man, but an instrument. The first attack began at dawn. The cannons roared across the plain, shaking the air like the voice of an angry god. Black powder smoke swallowed the sun, and the snow turned gray with ash. The walls of Kazan shuddered beneath the impact, but did not break. From atop the battlements, the defenders fought with desperate valor. Arrows rained down like locusts, and the cries of the wounded merged with the chanting of priests below. For every fallen soldier, Ivan ordered 2 more to advance. The siege was not a battle, it was a sacrifice. Weeks passed. The dead were buried in shallow graves beneath the frost, their bodies stiff and pale as icons carved from marble. The wounded crawled through mud frozen into stone. The air smelled of gunpowder and burning oil, of flesh and incense intertwined. And through it all, Ivan prayed, not in words, but in ritual kneeling before relics, his lips moving silently as the cannons thundered outside. He believed each explosion carried his faith across the sky, like thunder carrying a prayer to heaven. But heaven remained silent. One night, As the wind screamed across the camp, lightning tore open the clouds. The storm fell upon the army with snow and fury. Many took it as an omen that the Lord himself was warning the Tsar. Ivan did not. To him, the storm was approval, a cleansing baptism before divine victory. When dawn came, the snow had buried the dead. The world seemed reborn, white and pure. Ivan rose from his tent, his breath misting in the air, and raised his hand toward the city. At that signal, the assault began anew. This time they came not with siege towers or rams, but with fire. Oil-soaked cloths were hurled over the walls, flames licking at the wood and stone. The defenders screamed as the heat devoured their fortifications. From his vantage point, Ivan watched the inferno spread, reflected in his eyes like the birth of a new Sunday. The Volga ran black with ash and red with blood. Flames painted the sky in hues of judgment. Every cry that rose from within the city became a hymn in his ears, a hymn of purification. He whispered to himself, though none heard, "This is the price of salvation." When the walls finally cracked, the Tsar's banners surged through the breach. No trumpet sounded, no cheer rose. Only the relentless march of armored men through fire and ruin. Kazan's streets ran with blood and rain, and still they pressed forward. Ivan entered the city on horseback. The smoke curled around him like incense, the flames lighting his path. He dismounted before the great mosque now desecrated, its doors shattered, its holy books trampled into mud. He stood before the altar, gazing upon the ruin of what once was sacred, and crossed himself. In that moment, he felt both triumph and terror. Triumph for victory, terror for what he had become. The wind carried the sound of prayers, some in Russian, some in Tatar, rising together in a final, desperate harmony. It was as if heaven itself mourned. Ivan fell to his knees, the cross clutched in his hands. The metal was hot from the fire, but he did not flinch. He pressed it to his lips and whispered a silent vow. Never again would Russia bow to any power, earthly or divine. The city burned for 3 days. When the smoke finally cleared, Kazan was nothing but blackened stone and echo. The Tsar rode through its ruins in silence, his face expressionless, his eyes reflecting only flame. Behind him, the Oprichnina followed, their black horses splattered with ash. From that day forward, the people called him the Hand of God. And yet, those who saw him up close swore that his hands, once white and delicate, had turned the color of blood. Every empire begins with a prayer and ends with fire. The conquest of Kazan marked the birth of a new Russia and the death of Ivan's humanity. For in that victory, he had learned that holiness could justify anything, even hell itself. The smoke of Kazan drifted for days, an endless shroud that refused to lift. From the ashes of the conquered city, black birds rose, circling the broken towers like omens etched upon the sky. The snow that once lay white was now gray with soot and streaked with blood. And in the center of that ruin, Ivan stood silent, his crown glinting through the haze like a wound of gold. His soldiers knelt before him, the Oprichnina, cloaked in black, their faces hidden behind iron masks, bowed their heads. They did not cheer, they only waited. Because victory, in Ivan's eyes, was not cause for celebration, it was proof of divine favor, and divine favor demanded fear. He ordered the banners to be raised over the smoldering citadel. The Orthodox cross was planted upon the rubble of the Tatar mosque, its metal heated by the fires still raging below. The priests chanted hymns of triumph, their voices trembling as they mixed with the crackle of burning timber. Smoke and incense became indistinguishable, their scents merging into one thick breath that suffocated the air. The Tsar's face was calm, but his eyes were empty. Those who looked upon him whispered later that he no longer seemed human, more like a statue carved from the very ice of Russia, crowned with divine judgment. He commanded that the fallen be buried in a single pit, friend and foe alike. The earth drank their blood without distinction. Above the mass grave, a single wooden cross was planted, and upon it the words were carved, "God's will be done." That night, Ivan walked alone through the ruins. Snow fell again, covering the dead, as if heaven itself wished to hide what it had witnessed. The streets were quiet now, only the faint hiss of dying fires remained. He wandered into what had once been a mosque, now reduced to broken pillars and scorched calligraphy. There, amidst the debris, he found a fragment of a holy book half burned, its letters still visible through the soot. He picked it up, held it to the light, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his gaze. Remorse, perhaps, or awe. He turned the page, and it disintegrated in his hand. Outside, the river Volga flowed slow and silent, carrying the ashes of the city toward the horizon. Ivan watched the current, and for the first time, he smiled. To him, it was not destruction, it was baptism. Russia had been reborn in flame. Word of the conquest spread swiftly. In Moscow, bells rang for 7 days. Priests declared Ivan the chosen hand of God, the unifier of Christian Russia. Songs were written. Chroniclers recorded his deeds as miracles. But behind every hymn of praise, a whisper followed of the cruelty, of the rivers that ran red, of the innocents burned for the sake of faith. The Tsar returned to Moscow triumphant, but he no longer rode as a man. He rode as a symbol. His eyes, cold and unwavering, bore the weight of a conviction that transcended mercy. In his court, boyars bowed deeper than ever, their lips trembling as they blessed his name. They did not see a ruler, they saw a living storm. Within the Kremlin, Ivan ordered a new cathedral to be built, a monument to victory, to faith, to fire. It would stand on the Red Square, a temple that would outshine every palace and fortress. He demanded domes shaped like flames, walls painted in the color of blood and gold. The architects worked day and night, their designs drawn as if in fever. And each time they asked how high the towers should rise, Ivan would point toward heaven and whisper, "Higher." As the foundations were laid, he retreated into solitude. He prayed for hours before the icons, his forehead pressed to the cold stone floor, his breath fogging the marble. In the candlelight, his shadow stretched across the chamber, long, dark, and distorted. Sometimes it seemed to move on its own, a second Ivan, kneeling beside him like an unseen twin made of smoke. The boyars grew restless. They began to whisper that the Tsar had gone mad, that victory had turned his soul to iron, but none dared speak it aloud. Not after Kazan. One evening, during Mass, Ivan stood before his people in the cathedral of the Dormition. The incense hung thick in the air, the choir's chant echoing from the domes above. He lifted the relics of war, a sword, a cross, a piece of burnt stone from Kazan, and laid them upon the altar. To the gathered priests, it was an act of thanksgiving. To Ivan, it was a covenant. He swore in silence that Russia would forever walk the path he had carved through fear, through faith, through fire. That no foreign power, no divided boyar, no shadow of heresy would ever again threaten the throne or the church. From this oath would rise the doctrine that would define his reign. Oprichnina, a world within a world. A kingdom ruled not by law, but by devotion. When the ceremony ended, the candles were extinguished one by one, and the Tsar's face vanished into the dark. The choir's final note lingered in the air like a ghost. Outside, the snow began again, soft and endless, burying the city in white silence. But beneath that silence, something had changed. Moscow no longer felt like a city of men. It felt like a cathedral built for fear. In the months that followed, Ivan's dreams grew violent. He saw himself walking through endless corridors of fire, hearing voices that called him both savior and demon. He awoke each night drenched in sweat, convinced that angels were whispering in his ear. And yet, in the morning, his resolve only hardened. If heaven spoke, then he would obey, even if the message came in screams. He began wearing black more often, his robes embroidered with silver crosses. He carried the relic of a saint in one hand and a whip in the other. Those who looked into his eyes saw no distinction between holiness and hatred, and perhaps In that moment, neither did he. For Ivan believed that God had chosen him not to rule men but to judge them. And judgment, he decided, would begin with those who had once made him suffer. Winter deepened over Moscow, swallowing the sun for weeks at a time. Frost crept through the walls of the Kremlin like veins of ice, and every sound, every whisper, every prayer seemed to echo against stone too ancient to forget. It was in this silence that Ivan began to create a new world. He called it not a court, not an army, but a sanctuary, a brotherhood forged in the name of divine purification. Its members, dressed in black, hooded, faceless, relentless. They rode black horses through the snow, the breath of the beasts turning to mist like ghosts of judgment. Each carried two symbols, a dog's head, to scent out treachery, and a broom, to sweep away the sins of the Tsar's enemies. They called themselves the Oprichnina, and wherever their shadows fell, silence followed. From the highest towers to the smallest villages, the people learned to recognize the sound of their approach, distant hooves, slow and steady, echoing like the beating of a dark heart. Doors closed, candles were snuffed out, and prayers were whispered in secret. But no prayer could stop them, for they believed they did not serve men, they served the hand of God. Ivan no longer ruled from the Kremlin alone. He built a second domain within the heart of Moscow, his Oprichnina. It was a city within a city, walled off from the rest of Russia by fear. Inside, black banners hung from every tower, marked with a skull and a cross. Monks chanted psalms day and night, while the air reeked of incense and iron. To enter was to leave the world of men and step into a theater of divine judgment. Each morning, the Tsar attended Mass in his private chapel. The choir's voices were hollow, drawn out like lamentations for the living. When the candles flickered, their flames seemed to bend toward him, as though the light itself feared to disobey. He knelt before the altar, the shadow of the crown falling across his face. And when he rose, even the priests dared not look him in the eye. Outside, his riders moved through the streets in procession. The people bowed low, not out of reverence, but from terror that their gaze might be misread as defiance. Children were taken from homes and placed in Oprichnina schools, where they learned only one lesson: loyalty is salvation, doubt is sin. The Black Riders became priests of terror, baptizing the empire in fear. Rumors spread like frostbite of noblemen vanishing in the night, of monasteries seized, of whispers punished by the lash. Entire families disappeared, their estates given to the faithful. The Tsar called it purification, but the earth called it famine. In the frozen countryside, peasants burned their own fields rather than surrender them to the Tsar's men. Cattle froze in the snow, and hunger stalked the land like an invisible predator. Yet, in Moscow, the churches rang their bells in praise. The contradiction did not trouble Ivan. To him, suffering was proof that Russia was being cleansed. At night, from the towers of his black citadel, he would watch the city below. The fires of the Oprichnina burned bright against the darkness, a constellation of punishment. He saw not cruelty, but order, not fear, but faith. And in the hollow wind, he heard what he believed was the voice of God, whispering approval. Time became a blur of executions, prayers, and decrees. Ivan's council no longer spoke. They merely listened. One by one, the boyars who once tormented him as a child fell, some to the axe, others to the noose. In their deaths, he saw justice. In their silence, he saw peace. But the peace of Moscow was the peace of a graveyard. In the courtyards of the Kremlin, heads were displayed on spikes, blackened by the cold. Each bore a placard, "For the cleansing of the realm." Crows gathered, unbothered by the hymns that echoed from the churches nearby. The priests said nothing. Their voices had been bought by survival. Within his private chambers, Ivan's world shrank. He surrounded himself with relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, locks of Anastasia's hair sealed in glass. To the few who still saw him, he appeared more monk than monarch. But beneath the robes, the fury remained. Each night, before he slept, he dipped his fingers into holy water and traced the sign of the cross over his chest. The gesture had once been a plea for protection. Now it was a command to himself, to his God, to his demons. The line between them was gone. When dawn came, the Oprichnina rode again, through the frost, through the villages, through the hearts of those who still remembered mercy. The Tsar's will moved with them, invisible yet absolute. Their swords glinted like shards of black glass, reflecting nothing but firelight. In the distance, the Kremlin bells tolled again. Not for victory, not for prayer, for power, and in that sound, the deep, resonant hum of iron and faith, the empire of Ivan took its true form. An empire where God's name was written in ash and his judgment delivered by men with the heads of dogs. The Oprichnina was no longer just a brotherhood. It was a religion, and Ivan was its prophet. The year was one of endless winter. Snow no longer fell in flakes, but in silence, thick, heavy, suffocating. Across the empire, the Oprichnina moved like a storm without mercy. Villages turned to ashes. Churches became courts of judgment. Every prayer, every confession, ended with the same words, for the Tsar and for God. In Moscow, the Tsar commanded a feast. It would be, he said, a celebration of faith. But to those who had seen his eyes, it was the herald of another kind of sacrament. Within the walls of the Oprichnina palace, the great hall was transformed into a cathedral of terror. Long tables draped in black velvet stretched beneath the vaulted ceilings. Candles burned with blue flames, their wax dripping like frozen tears. The air was thick with incense and blood, indistinguishable from one another. The Oprichnina entered first, hundreds of them, silent as monks, their armor polished to a mirror's gleam. At the center of the hall stood the Tsar's throne, carved from oak darkened by smoke and age. Behind it hung a great icon not of Christ, but of the Archangel Michael striking down the dragon. Its eyes were cold, unblinking, and beneath its shadow, Ivan Saturday, the feast began not with laughter, but with prayer. The choir sang a hymn of salvation, but the words trembled like those of men who no longer believed in heaven. The Tsar raised a chalice of wine, red as the blood on his crown. When he drank, the Oprichnina followed, and so began the ritual. For every toast, a name was read aloud. A noble, a bishop, a merchant, accused of treason. For each name, a man was brought forward, dragged by the black riders into the center of the hall. There, under candlelight and holy icons, he was judged. No witness, no trial, only confession, carved in flesh. The Tsar did not speak. He watched, his eyes steady, his hand tracing the sign of the cross as the swords fell. Blood pooled at his feet, mingling with the spilled wine, staining the marble crimson. Each execution was followed by another hymn, louder than the last, until the music became indistinguishable from screams. When the last man fell, Ivan rose. He walked through the bodies as if through a garden, his robes dragging through the blood. To his followers, this was sanctification, Russia reborn through sacrifice. To the dead, it was eternity without forgiveness. Outside, the bells of Moscow tolled again, not for mourning, for obedience. From that night onward, the Oprichnina grew even more zealous. They saw visions in their sleep, visions of angels wielding swords of flame, cleansing the world with fire. They marched across Russia like missionaries of death, baptizing cities in terror. Kazan, Pskov, Novgorod, all felt the cold hand of the Tsar's purification. In their black monasteries, the Oprichnina sang as they killed. They fasted before executions, prayed before tortures, and spoke of sin as though it were a disease only pain could cure. Their leader, the Tsar, became less man than myth. Some said he could see into hearts. Others said he no longer slept, that his eyes never closed even in darkness. And in truth, sleep had become his enemy. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw her Anastasia standing at the edge of his dreams. She said nothing. She only looked at him with pity, and the pity was worse than hate. He would wake in fury, convinced that her ghost had been sent by the traitors who poisoned her. Each haunting became another reason to cleanse, another name to erase. One night, during Mass, Ivan stood before his private altar. The candles flickered, though no wind stirred. He pressed his forehead against the cold metal of the cross and whispered a prayer that was half confession, half command. When he raised his head, his reflection in the icon seemed not his own. The eyes staring back were darker, deeper, no longer human. That night, he ordered a new decree. No one, not even the Oprichnina, was safe from suspicion. Those who faltered in faith were to be purged. The brotherhood began to consume itself. Men who had ridden together for years now watched one another with dread. Whispers replaced loyalty. Fear replaced faith. Every oath was a death sentence waiting to be spoken. And above them all, Ivan sat upon his throne, serene in madness, convinced that God was purifying even his own chosen knights. By the winter's end, the once mighty Oprichnina was a shadow of itself. Villages were deserted, fields lay fallow, and Moscow smelled of smoke and sanctity. The Tsar had conquered everything except his own mind. He walked the empty halls of his palace, the echoes of his boots like distant thunder. The walls seemed to breathe. The icon seemed to watch, and in the silence, he heard again that same whisper that had haunted him since childhood. Now they will fear you. He smiled, not in triumph, but in recognition. The child who had once trembled in the dark had become the darkness itself. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow, silent, endless. The fires of the Oprichnina dimmed, but the stain they left upon Russia would never fade. The snow fell heavier that winter, so thick it swallowed sound itself. Across the northern horizon, the frozen forests groaned beneath the weight of ice, and beyond them, like a whisper from a forgotten age, rose the towers of Novgorod the Great, the city of merchants, monasteries, and saints. For centuries, Novgorod had been a jewel of faith and freedom. Its people traded with the Norse and the Germans, their streets filled with foreign tongues and golden icons. It was the beating heart of a different Russia, one of commerce, reason, and proud independence. But to the Tsar, independence had become another word for rebellion. Ivan had not forgotten the whispers. His spies brought rumors wrapped in fear letters, secret prayers, meetings in the dark. They said Novgorod plotted with Lithuania. They said the archbishop himself had blessed treason. Each rumor became a spark, and Ivan, ever the believer in divine fire, would set the world ablaze to prove his loyalty to God. He rode north with an army of 20,000. Black banners cut across the white landscape like open wounds. At the front, the Oprichnina rode in silence, their faces hidden behind iron masks, their horses draped in black cloth. Behind them came the priests, chanting psalms of judgment. And in the midst of it all, the Tsar himself, wrapped in furs, his crown glinting faintly beneath the dying light, led what he called the procession of purification. When Novgorod's bells first tolled, it was not for welcome, but for warning. The city's gates closed. The river Volkhov froze in silence, trapping ships like bones beneath the ice. Women gathered their children in prayer, while men sharpened blades they knew could not save them. Ivan arrived on the eve of Epiphany. To his followers, it was a holy day. To Novgorod, it was the day God turned his face away. At dawn, the Tsar's banners appeared through the mist. He ordered the great monastery opened for inspection, claiming to search for treason hidden behind icons. The monks obeyed. They brought out the relics of the saints, the bones, the chalices, the ancient manuscripts, hoping that faith might soften his will. But Ivan saw only hypocrisy. To him, every golden chalice was bought with betrayal, every prayer, a lie whispered against his crown. He ordered the city sealed. No one in, no one out. The Oprichnina spread through the streets like a plague. They searched homes, overturned altars, burned documents, and dragged priests into the snow. Every corner of the city echoed with the creak of boots and the tolling of distant bells. The people watched from windows, silent, knowing that to speak was to disappear. Then came the interrogations. In the square before St. Sophia Cathedral, wooden scaffolds were raised, not for building but for cleansing. Ivan decreed that each man would prove his loyalty by surviving the cold. One by one, citizens were stripped, doused with water, and left to freeze in the wind. The Oprichniki stood watch, singing hymns as the condemned turned to ice. And yet Ivan prayed. Each night, before the crucifix, he knelt upon the stone floor, whispering to God that he was doing his work. He saw himself as the new Moses purging the idolaters from the promised land. He told his heart that mercy was weakness, and weakness was sin. But even as he prayed, he felt the silence of heaven pressing upon him like a weight he could not bear. The river thawed slightly in the warmth of death. Bodies lay scattered along the banks, frozen in gestures of pleading. The snow no longer looked white. It had taken the color of rust and sorrow. As the days passed, the Tsar's paranoia deepened. He began to see treachery in every face, every prayer, every flickering candle. His soldiers brought forth prisoners in chains, men accused of nothing more than having once smiled too long or looked away too soon. Ivan would raise his hand, and the black-robed riders would obey without hesitation. At sunset, when the last light bled across the ice, the executions began in earnest. The Oprichniki carried out their orders with ritual precision. They cast the bound bodies into holes carved through the river ice, baptizing them in water and terror. The screams rose, echoing across the frozen plain, then vanished beneath the current. And yet, the Tsar wept. He said the tears were holy, that suffering was a sacrament, and that Russia would be reborn through its pain. But to those who watched from behind shuttered doors, his tears were the tears of a man who had lost not his mercy, but his soul. By the end of the first week, Novgorod no longer resembled a city. Smoke hung in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. Church bells were melted for coin, icons torn apart for the gold leaf beneath their paint. The market stood empty, the cathedral silent. The city of saints had become a graveyard for the faithful. And still Ivan prayed. He stood at the altar of St. Sophia, his shadow long across the cracked tiles. Behind him, the Oprichniki knelt like monks, their armor glinting with candlelight and blood. The Tsar's voice trembled as he asked for absolution, not for himself, but for his people. He told God that Russia was pure now, that her sins had been washed away in holy water and flame. But the echo that returned was hollow. It was not heaven's reply. It was the sound of his own heart, breaking beneath the weight of belief. Outside, the Volkhov flowed again, thick, red, and slow. The ice groaned under the burden of the drowned, and the wind that moved through the empty streets carried no hymn, only a single truth. No God answers the prayers of the merciless. The smoke had settled. What remained was silence, an ocean of it, stretching from the frozen gates to the river's red heart. The bells had stopped ringing, the churches had stopped praying, and yet the air still vibrated with something unholy. Novgorod no longer breathed. It only remembered. Ivan walked the empty streets like a priest after apocalypse. His boots cracked the frozen blood beneath his feet. His breath rose in clouds like the ghosts of those he'd slain. He looked upon the city he had loved for its beauty, and now ruled for its ashes. Every corner whispered accusation. Every shadow bore a name. He entered the cathedral again, St. Sophia, the mother of all Russian churches. The walls, once golden, were blackened by smoke. The icons of Christ and the Virgin stared back through cracked glass, their eyes seeming to judge him in silence. Candles still burned where the faithful had died, their wax mixed with the blood of the innocent. And in that cold sanctuary, Ivan fell to his knees. He prayed not for victory, not for forgiveness, but for meaning. "Let this have purpose," he murmured to the emptiness. "Let their deaths not be wasted." But the silence was endless. Even his own echo refused to return. Outside, the river Volkhov continued to devour. Each thaw brought new bodies to the surface, faces pale, hands folded, as if still praying beneath the ice. The Oprichnina worked in grim devotion, dragging corpses from the water, blessing them, then burning them once more, as if trying to erase the memory of their own deeds. But fire cannot cleanse blood. It only changes its color. Ivan watched them from the monastery balcony. He told himself he was witnessing purification. He told himself that Russia was being reborn. Yet deep inside, something began to shift, a small, almost imperceptible tremor in his faith. For the first time, the Tsar felt not righteous, but afraid. At night, he dreamt. He saw the river again, vast and endless, but the water was clear this time. In it, he saw faces: Anastasia, his mother, the boyars he had executed, the monks, the peasants, all drifting beneath the surface, their eyes open. They stared at him, not with hatred, but with sorrow. And then the river turned black, and their faces vanished, leaving only his own reflection staring back. But the reflection smiled when he did not. He awoke trembling. A candle burned beside his bed, casting his shadow upon the wall. The shadow seemed to move on its own, bending over him like a specter. It whispered in the voice of conscience, or perhaps of God. It said, "You have baptized Russia in blood." The next morning, he ordered the executions to stop. The Oprichnina hesitated, uncertain if this was mercy or madness. He dismissed them all, one by one, sending them back into the world they had helped destroy. Only the snow remained loyal. For weeks, Ivan wandered the ruined streets of Novgorod alone. He entered homes half-burned, touching the toys of dead children, the icons nailed above shattered hearths. He found a family Bible, its pages stiff with frost, and within it, a note written by a priest before his death. God sees the hand that kills in his name, and he weeps not for the dead, but for the living who believe they do his will. Ivan kept the note. He pressed it to his heart as if to keep it from freezing, but it did not warm him. Nothing did anymore. Spring came slowly that year. When the river finally thawed, its waters turned clear again, as if the land itself was trying to forget. Grass sprouted among the ashes. The air no longer smelled of death but of wet earth. And yet the Tsar could not forget. He looked upon the reborn city and saw only graves beneath the bloom. He returned to Moscow in silence. The bells rang for his triumph, but the people bowed without joy. They saw the man, not the monarch, the hollow eyes, the tremor in his hands. They called him Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. But Grozny meant more than terrible. It meant the one who inspires dread. It meant the one before whom even angels tremble. In the Kremlin, he rebuilt his chapel. He filled it with candles that never burned out, one for every soul lost in Novgorod. At night, their light flickered across the marble floor, like waves of red. He knelt among them, whispering each name he could remember, his voice hoarse with repentance that would never find forgiveness. And yet somewhere deep inside he still believed he had been right, that to build an empire, one must first destroy its corruption, that purity required pain, that God's justice was cruel only because man's sin was infinite. This belief, twisted but sincere, became the foundation of his rule. It was the theology of iron and flame, and through it, Ivan turned Russia into something new, a nation forged not by love, but by fear. Years later, travelers would come to Novgorod and find it rebuilt. New churches rose upon the ashes. The people whispered prayers for the dead and cursed the Tsar in the same breath. They said the river still ran red some winters, as if remembering. They said that on cold nights, when the mist hung low, one could hear the sound of horses in chains moving through the fog. And if one listened closely, a single voice would echo through the ice. Mercy, mercy. Some said it was the wind. Others swore it was Ivan himself, his soul condemned to walk the river he had filled with blood. But history knows no ghosts, only men, and the shadows they leave behind. And in the Chronicles of Russia, the shadow of Ivan Grozny stretches farther than any saint's light could reach. He called it purification. We call it terror. But between those two words lies the entire tragedy of power. Because power, once baptized in blood, no longer serves God. It serves itself. Moscow slept under snow again. The Kremlin towers glimmered like frozen spears beneath the moon. Within its walls, the Tsar walked alone, a ghost among his own triumphs. Years had passed since Novgorod, yet the silence of that city had followed him like a stain. It clung to every corridor, every prayer, every night. Even his throne felt colder now, too heavy for one man, too sacred for the hands that held it. He still ruled, yes, but the fear that once kept Russia obedient now kept him awake. Each night, Ivan ordered candles lit through the palace halls, not for light, but to chase away what waited in the dark. He claimed it was for God's presence. But even God seemed to have left his court long ago. The walls whispered, the portraits stared, the bells outside rang not with glory, but warning. And in the heart of the Kremlin stood a chamber known only to him, the Hall of Shadows. It was not a hall of marble or gold. It was narrow, windowless, lined with black glass so polished it reflected everything and yet nothing truly. Ivan had ordered it built after Novgorod, claiming it was a place for meditation. The priest said it was a place where he spoke to God, but no one ever entered it twice. Inside, only the Tsar's footsteps dared to echo. He stood before the mirrored wall, his crown casting trembling light across its surface. His own reflection looked back older, thinner, with eyes hollow as the crypts beneath Moscow. He studied that face for hours, searching for something he had lost, a trace of the man he once was, perhaps, or the faith he once felt. But all he saw was the burden of divine right, the mask that no longer hid the monster beneath. He raised his hand. The reflection did the same, but when he lowered it, the reflection did not. Ivan froze. For a heartbeat, the mirrored figure stood still, then smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that did not belong to him. He stepped back, breath shallow. The candle flickered, and the shadow on the glass deepened until it no longer resembled his face at all. It was younger, fiercer, the Ivan of youth, before the cruelty, before the crown had swallowed him. The reflection spoke without words. Its eyes accused him. It showed him memories. Anastasia laughing in the palace garden, his mother's hand stroking his hair, his own hands as a boy clasped in prayer. Then it showed him fire, Novgorod burning, rivers of red, the corpses of children frozen mid-scream. He stumbled backward, clutching the cross around his neck, but even that felt heavy like a chain, not salvation. The reflection whispered now, voice low and hollow, echoing from inside his skull. You built your throne on bones. You crowned yourself in blood. You called it faith. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the voice was not in the room, it was in him. He saw the faces again, the people of Novgorod, the boyars he had executed, even his son, whose eyes carried both fear and devotion. They surrounded him in the mirrored walls, thousands of them, their gazes heavy and unblinking. He shouted their names, ordering them gone, but the glass only multiplied them. The mirrors rippled as though made of water. In their depths, he saw the river again, the Volkhov, its surface black with memory. And then, from beneath the water, his own reflection rose once more, smiling that same impossible smile. Ivan dropped to his knees, trembling. He whispered a prayer, but the words turned to ash in his mouth. The reflection reached out from the glass. For one terrible instant, he felt cold fingers brush his face. He screamed. The sound tore through the hall, shaking the candles from their stands. The flame died, leaving him in darkness. When the guards burst in, they found their Tsar alone, staring at the shattered wall, shards of mirror at his feet. Each fragment reflected a different piece of him, his eyes, his mouth, his crown, none of them aligned. He ordered the hall sealed. No one was ever to speak of it again. But even sealed rooms cannot keep ghosts. That night, Ivan returned to his chamber, his hands still shaking. He could not sleep. He could not stop seeing his own face smiling without him. He told himself it was temptation, a test from God, perhaps even a visitation from the devil. But deep down, he knew it was something worse. It was truth. He had not seen the devil. He had seen himself. And in that revelation lay the greatest horror. He no longer knew which one God would judge. In the days that followed, his servants noticed changes. He stopped attending council. He stopped eating with the boyars. He fasted, prayed, and whispered to empty rooms. Sometimes he would pause mid-sentence and turn his head, as if listening to someone unseen. The courtiers began to fear not his wrath, but his silence. One night, his son entered his chamber, carrying a candle. He found the Tsar bent over the floor, tracing the sign of the cross again and again on the stone with his own blood. "Father," the boy whispered, "what are you doing?" Ivan lifted his head. His eyes were wide, unfocused. "I am washing my soul," he murmured. Then, after a long pause, he added, "But it does not come clean." The candlelight flickered. For an instant, his shadow on the wall smiled when he did not. And though the boy said nothing, the fear in his eyes told a prophecy. Because even he could see that the man before him was no longer the ruler of Russia, only the prisoner of his own reflection. Winter grew harder, as if heaven itself had turned its face from Moscow. The rivers froze early, the bells cracked in the frost, and no voice rose from the cathedrals, except the hollow echo of prayers unanswered. Inside the Kremlin, the Tsar no longer spoke to men. He spoke only to God, or to whatever answered back. He spent his days in the chapel, kneeling before the icons until his knees bled. He would whisper, confess, beg, his voice trembling between command and confession. But no matter how long he prayed, the silence always returned. And in that silence, he began to hear something else. Footsteps, breathing, a heartbeat not his own. He felt watched. Every corridor, every shadow seemed to contain a presence that followed him, patient, cold, and mocking. Sometimes, when he passed a mirror, he caught a glimpse of it, his own reflection, lagging behind by a fraction of a second, smiling as he turned away. He ordered every mirror in the palace removed, shattered, or covered in black cloth. But even then, he saw himself reflected in things that were not mirrors, polished armor, puddles of melted snow, the eyes of his servants. The court whispered that the Tsar was haunted. But the truth was simpler. He was haunted by himself. Late one night, Ivan awoke to a sound like wind moving through stone. The fire had died. In the darkness, he saw a faint shimmer across the chamber floor, a pool of water, impossibly still. He rose, trembling, and approached it. The surface quivered with light, though there was no flame left to cast it. And there, looking up from the reflection, was the face he had tried to forget. The same cruel smile, the same eyes that once commanded armies, now empty and infinite. He spoke to it, not with words, but with the desperate language of thought. "What are you?" The reflection blinked. "I am what you made me." Ivan's breath caught. His hands trembled. He reached for the cross at his neck, but the chain broke. The cross fell into the pool and sank, vanishing without a ripple. "You prayed to God for power," the reflection whispered inside his mind, "and he gave it to you. Now you pray for forgiveness, but power does not forgive." He staggered back, shaking his head. "No," he muttered under his breath, voice cracking. "No more. I built Russia. I defended the faith. I am—" The reflection interrupted with a smile. "You are mine." The light flickered, and the reflection rose from the water like smoke. Its form was identical to his same crown, same robes, but its face glowed faintly from within, as if lit by fire beneath the skin. Ivan screamed and lunged forward, swinging the golden scepter that stood beside his bed. The blow passed through air, but the reflection struck back. He felt a searing pain in his chest. When he looked down, there was no wound, only the weight of his own heartbeat, hammering like a war drum. The specter leaned close, its voice a whisper that filled the entire room. You thought you could rule without mercy. You thought fear was faith. Now, see what fear becomes when it turns inward. The Tsar collapsed to his knees, clawing at the floor. His crown slid off and rolled into the shadows. He looked up. The reflection was gone. Only the mirror stood again before him. The last unbroken pane he had hidden behind the altar, untouched by order or rage. For a long moment, Ivan stared at it. His own face stared back, aged, broken, trembling. And for the first time, he saw not a ruler, not a saint, not even a sinner. He saw a man. He saw the boy who once cried in the corridors of Moscow, small and forgotten. He saw the husband who once held Anastasia's hand and swore to protect her. He saw the father who killed his own son. And all at once, the weight of every death, every scream, every prayer unanswered came crashing down upon him like the judgment of God himself. He screamed not in fury, but in despair. Then, with one final cry, he lifted the scepter and struck the mirror. The glass shattered, splintering into 1,000 pieces. Each shard fell around him like ice, catching the dim candlelight. Each shard reflected a different face, laughing, weeping, burning, praying every life he had taken, every soul he had damned. The floor glistened red from his hands, cut and bleeding. He sank among the fragments, gasping, and whispered to no one, "Forgive me." But the broken glass whispered back, "There is no forgiveness where there is no repentance." He wept until dawn. When the servants found him, he was still kneeling amid the shards, unmoving. The mirror was gone. Only the reflection of his tears remained, frozen into the floor. That morning, as the sun rose over Moscow, the bells rang again. The same bells that had tolled for victory now sounded hollow, brittle, tired. And in that cold light, Ivan rose from his prayer as a man who had seen his own soul and realized it was empty. From that day, his rule changed. He no longer roared. He whispered. He no longer commanded faith. He demanded silence. Even his enemies pitied him, though they dared not say it aloud. He gave gold to churches, built new cathedrals, and ordered daily prayers for the souls of the dead. But none of it washed away the image in the mirror. The boyars said he had grown pious. The peasants said he had grown mad. But those who had seen his eyes knew the truth. Ivan had looked into his own heart and found nothing left to fear, because he had already met the thing fear becomes. A man who sees his reflection and cannot look away. As night returned, he would sit alone in his chamber, staring into a bowl of water placed before a single candle. Sometimes he would speak softly, as if to someone unseen. Sometimes he would smile, and the smile would not reach his eyes. The servants whispered that he spoke to angels. But the truth was simpler and far more terrible. He was speaking to the mirror that no longer existed. The cruel never sleep. They dream in screams. And when they wake, they find that the echo comes from within. The corridors of the Kremlin no longer echoed with command, but with hesitation. The once mighty voice of Ivan had grown thin, cracked, like ice before it breaks. He walked slower now, his robes dragging like chains behind him. Those who crossed his path lowered their eyes, not out of respect, but fear of being seen by a man who seemed to see through souls. The empire he built was vast. The land stretched farther than the reach of his armies. The churches gleamed with gold, and the bells of Moscow sang his name across the snow. But within that splendor lived silence, a silence too deep, too deliberate. The Tsar's court had become a theater of ghosts. Boyars bowed without words. Servants moved like shadows. Priests avoided his gaze when offering blessings. And through this court of silence moved Ivan's son, the Tsarevich, radiant, strong, and young. He was everything his father had once dreamed of being. and everything the father could no longer bear to see. Ivan Ivanovich was the hope of Russia. He had the face of youth unbroken by cruelty, the fire of a man who believes still in destiny, not fear. He rode among soldiers, blessed the poor, spoke with priests not as master but as man. To the people, he was not a czar's heir, he was redemption made flesh. And yet, each time Ivan looked at him, something cold and sharp twisted inside the old ruler's chest. He saw his son's kindness and mistook it for weakness. He saw mercy and called it betrayal, because in a world where power was built on terror, compassion was a crime against the throne. The Tsar began to watch him, not as a father, but as one watches an enemy who has not yet declared war. The court felt the tension first. In the great hall, when the son knelt to speak with his father, Ivan's fingers gripped the armrest of his throne until his knuckles whitened. When the boyar whispered praise of the prince, Ivan's eyes darkened like gathering storm. He would smile, slow and cold, and say nothing. But when night fell, his chambers burned with candlelight as he paced alone, whispering to himself, arguing with ghosts only he could hear. To some, it seemed the old madness had returned. But those who listened closely realized it was something worse. It was reason, twisted by fear. Winter came again, and with it, the famine. Fields lay barren beneath ice. Wolves howled closer to the villages. And while the people starved, Moscow continued its rituals of gold and incense. The Tsarevich, defying his father's orders, left the Kremlin to deliver aid. He gave bread, money, and warmth to the people. They knelt before him not as they knelt before the Tsar, but as one kneels before hope. When Ivan heard of this, he did not see compassion. He saw rebellion. To his mind, the boy had done what no soldier dared. He had given the people something greater than fear, faith in another ruler. That night, the Tsar summoned his son. The hall was cold, lit only by the flames of the great hearth. The snow outside pressed against the windows like ghosts trying to enter. Ivan sat on the throne, wrapped in furs, his crown set beside him, not upon his head, but close, as though he no longer felt worthy to wear it. The Tsarevich entered, bowing deeply. His face was calm, but his eyes carried both sorrow and defiance. The old man studied him for a long time. He saw not a son, but a mirror once more, a reflection of what he had lost, and what he could never reclaim. For a moment there was silence so heavy it seemed to bend the air itself. Then Ivan spoke not in rage, but in a voice heavy with fatigue and suspicion. He questioned his son's loyalty, his motives, his mercy. Why did he leave without permission? Why give aid without the Tsar's decree? Why win hearts that were not his to claim? The young man bowed his head, his hands trembling. He spoke softly of duty, of faith, of the people's suffering. He said he acted for Russia, for the same land his father had sworn to protect. But in the Tsar's ears, the words rang hollow. He heard only rebellion dressed as virtue. His hand tightened around the golden scepter beside him. Outside, thunder rolled across the frozen sky. Though there were no clouds, the servants waiting beyond the doors heard nothing, only the steady rhythm of two voices rising, breaking, falling, and then silence. A silence so complete it devoured even the fire's crackle. Inside, the Tsar rose to his feet, trembling not from age, but from something far darker. His heart pounded, his vision blurred. He saw not his son, but every betrayal that had ever haunted him. Boyars sneering, advisors lying, the poison in Anastasia's cup, all of it now standing before him, wearing his son's face. The golden scepter gleamed in his hand, its surface reflecting firelight like blood. He took a step forward. In that instant, something in the air seemed to hold its breath. The world paused. For a heartbeat, the old Tsar's eyes softened, as though the father within him clawed upward, desperate to speak, to forgive. But it was too late. The madness had already answered the question his soul could not. With a cry that was half roar, half sob, Ivan swung. The scepter struck flesh. A sound, sharp, soft, final cut through the chamber. The Tsarevich staggered. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his body folded gently like a candle collapsing into wax. The scepter clattered against the floor. Ivan stared, disbelieving, as blood pooled beneath his son's head, dark, spreading, silent. The world seemed to tilt. The fire dimmed. The Tsar's breath turned shallow. He fell to his knees beside the body. No, the word escaped not as command, not as lament, but as prayer. But there was no God left to hear him. The door burst open. Servants and guards rushed in, their faces white with horror. They saw their ruler kneeling beside his dying son, the golden scepter fallen from his hand, his crown overturned on the stone floor. And there, amid the frozen silence of the Kremlin, Russia watched its future bleed away. The sound of the scepter still lingered in the air, an invisible echo that refused to fade. It was the sound of a father's hand breaking the order of the universe. The fire in the hearth guttered low. The torches trembled as if the walls themselves could feel what had been done. The Tsarevich lay still. His blood, warm and red, crept slowly across the marble floor, carving a path that reached the steps of the throne and stopped there, as though even death itself refused to climb that final height. Ivan knelt beside him, his breath ragged, his face hollow, his fingers, those same fingers that had once crowned princes and condemned traitors, now trembled as they touched the body of his only son. The warmth was leaving. The boy's eyes, still half open, held no judgment, only a terrible calm, like the final mercy of silence after a scream. Ivan's chest heaved. He pressed his hand to the wound as if he could hold the soul inside, as if power itself could reverse what power had done. But the blood came faster, unstoppable, eternal. The great hall was empty except for the two of them, the father and the future. Beyond the doors, guards waited, frozen in terror. None dared move. None dared breathe. The Tsar began to rock back and forth, a rhythm born of madness and grief. His crown lay overturned beside him, its jewels reflecting the firelight like 1,000 accusing eyes. He whispered nothing, yet the silence became language. It spoke of all he had built, all he had destroyed, and all that now lay broken between his hands. His robes, soaked in red, clung to him like guilt that would never wash away. Time dissolved. Outside, the storm grew wild. Snow fell heavy upon the Kremlin's golden domes, each flake descending like a soul seeking peace. Inside, the Tsar remained motionless. Minutes became hours. The boy's blood cooled. When dawn came, its light entered through the stained glass red and gold. For a moment, it painted father and son in a holy glow, as though heaven itself tried to disguise the horror beneath a veil of sanctity. But light, no matter how divine, cannot hide the truth. Word spread across Moscow before sunrise. The Tsarevich was dead. The Tsar had killed him. The city did not scream. It whispered, and the whisper spread faster than fire. Priests crossed themselves in fear. Women hid their children. The bells that once sang of victory now tolled like funerals. Moscow became a cathedral of mourning, one not for the dead prince, but for the soul of the nation itself. In his chambers, Ivan sat alone. The throne beside him was empty, eternally so. He stared at his hands for hours, as though the lines upon them might reveal a prophecy. He could still feel the weight of the scepter, the tremor of bone giving way, the warmth of blood splashing across gold. No crown could bear that memory. He had become a man haunted not by what he had lost, but by what he had taken. Night after night, he prayed. The candles burned until their wax pooled like tears. He prayed to a God he had long ago claimed to serve. He begged for the return of his son, for forgiveness, for silence, for anything. But no voice came, and in that silence, Ivan realized the truth, that all his life he had not prayed to God, but to power, and power, unlike God, never forgives. As months passed, his body began to fade. The mighty frame that once led armies now bent beneath invisible weight. His beard, once black as iron, turned white like frost upon tombs. His eyes, once blazing with divine conviction, grew hollow, staring beyond the world as though seeing something no one else could. Every night, the same vision returned. The face of his son not in anger, but in pity. The wound that never closed, the silence that swallowed heaven. He built chapels in memory of his heir. He gave gold to monasteries, ordered masses sung, walls painted, crosses raised. But even the priests knew, no amount of prayer could clean the stain written upon the heart of the Tsar. In every cathedral, he saw the same image, Christ holding the body of his son. And for the first time, Ivan understood what it meant to be both the hand and the nail. He wept not as king, not as saint, not as monster, but as man. Yet even his tears seemed to turn to blood before they reached the floor. Winter returned once more. The Kremlin slept beneath its shroud of white, as if trying to forget. In the great hall, the same where the fatal blow had fallen, the Tsar ordered a single candle to burn at all hours. He said it was to light the soul of his son, but in truth, it was to remind himself that darkness had no end. The flame flickered day after day, year after year, until those who served him swore they could see two shadows on the wall, one of the father still living, one of the son still watching. Time, like mercy, left him behind. The empire endured, but its heart grew cold. What he had united through fear began to fracture beneath grief. Even the Oprichnina whispered prayers now not for their Tsar, but for their own salvation. Ivan had given Russia a single vision of power so absolute it devoured everything, including love. And when love was gone, only terror remained. One night, near the end, he rose from his throne and walked through the corridors alone. The halls echoed with memories, the laughter of a boy running through the palace gardens, the song of a mother long buried, the whisper of a priest asking if mercy still existed. He stopped before a mirror. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, slowly, his reflection emerged not as king or tyrant, but as father. His face streaked with age, his crown gone, his eyes endless pits of sorrow. Behind him, in the glass, stood the faint image of his son, young, whole, radiant. The ghost smiled once, softly, before vanishing like a breath in winter air. The Tsar fell to his knees. Moscow slept that night under the quiet of snow. But within the Kremlin, a single cry rose to the heavens, a sound that was not of power, not of madness, but of grief too vast for any god to carry. The cry of a father. The cry of a ruler who had finally met the price of his own throne. And when morning came, the candle still burned. Its flame, fragile yet stubborn, swayed above the pool of dried blood on the marble floor. It was all that remained of mercy in the empire of fear. The snows had melted from the Kremlin's golden roofs, yet the chill never left the Tsar's chambers. Spring came to Moscow with its brief illusion of warmth, but inside the fortress of Ivan the Terrible, winter had made its home in the man himself. The empire breathed, markets reopened, bells sang, and processions wound through the narrow streets, but over all of it hung a silence that no sound could pierce. The silence of a kingdom without an heir. The silence of a ruler who had killed his future. Ivan moved like a shadow through his own palace. Once, courtiers scrambled to meet his gaze. Now, they lowered their heads as he passed, whispering prayers to saints they no longer believed in. The throne stood untouched, the crown polished yet hollow, as if mocking its absent master. Each night, the Tsar knelt before the icon wall, his knees bruised against the cold stone. He did not speak. He no longer trusted words. He simply stared at the candlelight until it blurred, imagining the flame devouring his sins one by one. But sin, like smoke, always finds a way to rise again. In the weeks after his son's death, Ivan ordered a grand cathedral to be built, a church, unlike any in Christendom. It would stand in Red Square, rising from the earth like an offering to heaven. He claimed it was for the glory of God. In truth, It was for the salvation of one man's soul. He summoned architects from across Russia and from distant lands beyond. They came with sketches and scrolls, with dreams of domes and towers and walls that could reach the divine. Yet none of them could look the Tsar in the eye for long. There was something in that gaze now, a depth that swallowed courage whole. He gave them one command only: to build beauty that could be seen from heaven itself. Day by day, the square filled with sound, the clatter of chisels, the rhythm of hammers, the chanting of masons marking each stone with prayer. The air smelled of lime and wet earth, of sweat and devotion, and among them, unseen, the Tsar himself would sometimes walk, wrapped in a dark cloak, watching as the foundation of his penance took shape. He watched the walls rise like penitent hands. He watched towers spiral upward like prayers turned to flame. And each time a new dome was set into place, its colors gleaming against the sun, he felt both pride and torment. He knew what the people said, that their Tsar sought forgiveness not from God, but from the ghost of his son, that the cathedral would be built upon blood and tears, and that no blessing could wash it clean. Ivan said nothing. He only built higher. Months became years. The cathedral climbed toward the heavens. 8 chapels encircled the 9th, each crowned with its own dome, some painted emerald and blue like the northern sky, others striped in red and gold like fire frozen in glass. When sunlight touched them, the domes shimmered as if alive. When the wind passed over, it whispered through the arches like 1,000 sighs. The people called it the Cathedral of the Intercession on the Moat. Later, they would call it something else, St. Basil's. But to Ivan, it was never just a church. It was a monument to remorse, a tower built from guilt and grace entwined. At night, he would return alone to the site. He would walk among the scaffolds, where the tools lay abandoned, where the moonlight pooled like water in unfinished stone. Sometimes, the snow returned and dusted the domes, turning them pale and ghostly. In those moments, Ivan felt the nearness of something, perhaps God, perhaps the spirit of his son, perhaps the echo of his own madness. He would trace his hand along the cold walls, feeling their pulse as if they might breathe. The walls did not answer, but they seemed to remember. In the moonlight, the cathedral became a reflection of himself, beautiful, terrible, impossible. The builders marveled at their work, yet they feared the man behind it. For every stone laid in worship, another was laid in fear. Rumors spread of workers who vanished after speaking his name aloud, of architects who prayed not for success, but for survival. They said that the Tsar had sworn that when the cathedral was finished, none alive would ever build its equal. They said he wanted to blind its makers so that no beauty could rival his guilt. Whether truth or legend, the fear grew with the walls. And fear, in Ivan's Russia, was the mortar that held everything together. When the final dome was raised, the city gathered to watch. The bells rang across the river, and snow fell in delicate spirals, as though heaven had come to see what man had built in its name. Ivan stood before the cathedral, his cloak trailing behind him, his breath clouding in the cold. Before him rose the culmination of all his sins and all his prayers, a cathedral that seemed to breathe, its domes like flames frozen mid-rise, its colors alive even in the winter light. The people bowed, the priests sang, and for a moment even the Tsar felt something like peace. But peace, for him, was only the brief silence before the next storm. That night, when all the crowds had gone and the bells had fallen still, Ivan remained. He entered the cathedral alone. The air inside was heavy with incense and shadow. Candles burned in endless rows, their flames trembling as if afraid. The floor beneath his feet was cold marble. He walked to the center beneath the tallest dome, where light from the high window spilled down like a single ray from heaven. He looked up. The ceiling seemed to stretch beyond sight, a labyrinth of color and faith. And in its painted saints, he saw faces, some holy, some hauntingly familiar, his sons among them. For a moment, Ivan felt the world spin. He reached out as if to touch the air, but it was gone before his hand could find it. He fell to his knees. The candlelight shuddered, and for the first time since that terrible day, he whispered not to God, but to the silence itself. The silence answered with nothing but echo. Outside, the snow began to fall again, covering the city in white. Each flake landed softly on the cathedral's domes, dissolving into nothing. But beneath them, the Tsar remained unmoved, a statue of a man still praying for forgiveness in a world that had already passed him by. The cathedral stood completed. Its towers pierced the sky like the fingers of a penitent giant, reaching for a god that had long turned his gaze away. For the people of Moscow, it was a miracle wrought of stone and color. For Ivan, it was a wound given shape. From a distance, the domes burned with impossible brilliance, green, gold, crimson, blue, like the very elements of heaven frozen in motion. But up close, in the pale light of dawn, their beauty seemed almost cruel. The walls were too perfect, the geometry too divine, as though the structure itself mocked the man who had demanded its birth. Ivan would walk through it alone at sunrise, each step echoing through corridors painted with saints who never smiled. He traced the walls with trembling fingers, feeling the cold kiss of stone that no longer brought comfort. It was said that the Tsar prayed here daily. In truth, he wandered like a ghost, trapped within his own confession. Outside Red Square began to stir. Merchants set up their stalls. Peasants crossed themselves as they passed the cathedral's shadow. Children whispered that the Tsar had built it as a stairway to heaven, so that he might climb to God and beg forgiveness face to face. But the elders, with eyes dulled by too much knowing, said otherwise. They said the Tsar built it to hide from his sins, that every dome was a locked chamber for another memory he could not bear to keep. And perhaps they were right. When the architects presented the final plan, the perfect symmetry, the holy unity of domes, Ivan stared in silence for a long while. Then he smiled, and those who saw it never forgot. It was not the smile of pride. It was the smile of a man who has realized that even beauty cannot save him. He stood beneath the largest dome, where the light from above fell like the gaze of heaven itself. The workers called it the Eye of God. To Ivan, it felt like judgment given form. He could not escape its light. No matter where he moved, the beam found him, tracing his figure as if the divine were watching him alone. He began to dread it, to imagine that it saw everything, that it saw his rage, his cruelty, his murdered son. Each morning, the light returned. Each night, it followed him into dreams. He could not tell if it was heaven's mercy or heaven's punishment. In time, the cathedral became not a place of worship, but of haunting. Ivan ordered that no other church in Russia should resemble it, that its beauty remain singular, eternal. The command was obeyed in silence, though what came next would turn obedience into terror. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, the Tsar summoned the lead architect. Their names were whispered later like curses: Barma and Postnik Yakovlev, men of divine vision and doomed hands. They stood before him trembling, their eyes wide with the terror of prophets who had seen too much. History would say that he blinded them so that no eyes which had seen such beauty might ever see again. Others would insist it was only rumor, born of fear and awe. Yet in Moscow's night, when the bells toll low, even now the wind seems to whisper their names, as if the stones themselves remember what the chronicles deny. And somewhere, perhaps, in the silence of that act, the Tsar believed he had preserved his masterpiece and damned himself forever. The years turned gray. Ivan's beard whitened, his body bent, but the fire in his gaze never dimmed. He retreated deeper into prayer, into isolation, into the cathedral he had built as his penance and prison both. The people rarely saw him anymore. When they did, he was wrapped in furs, his face pale as marble, his lips moving in endless murmurs no one dared interrupt. The empire still stood, its borders stretched vast and trembling, like a beast held together by faith and fear. But within the Kremlin walls, the Tsar of all the Russias sat alone, a man who had conquered every foe but could not defeat himself. Sometimes, He would sit beneath the central dome for hours, unmoving. The candlelight flickered over his face, carving deep shadows where once there had been fury. He stared upward, into the painted heavens. He saw angels carrying swords, saints with eyes of sorrow, and a Christ who looked neither wrathful nor kind, only distant. Ivan reached out his hand as though to grasp that unreachable face, but his arm trembled and fell. He felt the weight of the crown pressing upon his skull, the same crown that once made him divine, now heavy with damnation. He understood then that power was never a gift. It was a slow devouring, and he had been eaten alive long ago. Outside, the bells began to toll again. Their voices rolled over Moscow like thunder. The snow fell softly, covering roofs, crosses, corpses of time. In that endless white, the cathedral stood gleaming, an impossible jewel in a sea of sorrow. No monument could erase what had been done. No beauty could balance the scales. But still, men prayed beneath those domes, and their prayers, fragile, human, imperfect, rose into the same sky that had once judged the Tsar. Perhaps in that, there was something divine after all. When morning came, Ivan rose for what would become his final prayer. He walked through the corridors of the Kremlin slowly, his hand tracing the walls, as though saying farewell to the stones themselves. He entered the cathedral one last time. The eye of heaven awaited him, pouring down its light. He stood beneath it, the thinnest figure of a king now worn to bone. He lifted his cross and pressed it to his forehead, and in that cold, radiant silence, Ivan whispered his last confession, not in words, but in breath. The breath left him. The candle beside him flickered once, then went still. Outside, the city carried on. The markets opened. The bells rang. No one knew yet that the man who had ruled them through terror and faith alike was gone. Inside the cathedral, the Tsar's body remained beneath the light. Above him, the domes shimmered like a frozen sunrise. Below him, the earth was dark and still. For all his cruelty, all his brilliance, all his sins, Ivan had built something that would outlast him. A monument of contradictions, beauty born of horror, faith carved from fear, repentance immortalized in color. The eye of heaven still watched. It always would. In the great hall of the Kremlin, silence had taken the throne. The fire had burned low. The air hung heavy with incense and winter breath. Snow pressed against the windows like the ghost of a nation trying to look in. And upon the gilded seat of Russia, Ivan sat motionless, eyes half open, lips frozen mid-prayer. The cross still rested in his palm, slick with sweat and the faint shimmer of blood. His crown tilted, as if even gold had grown weary of its master. The chessboard before him was unfinished. White had made its move, black had never answered. Outside, dawn crept across Moscow, painting the ice roofs gold. The bells had not yet rung. The empire still slept, unaware that its master had left it in the night. For a long time, the guards did not approach. They watched from the doorway, their faces pale, their breath visible in the cold air. The Tsar had always seemed more ghost than man. Now he had become one. When at last they dared to touch him, his body was as cold as the marble floor beneath him. The scent of frankincense clung to his robes, mingled with something metallic and old like the echo of all the blood he had spilled. They laid him upon the floor before the altar. No words were spoken. None dared pray. For how does one pray for the soul of a man who had made himself a god? News spread through Moscow like a shadow rolling across snow. At first, disbelief. Then fear. Then something else. Relief perhaps, or guilt, or both at once. The peasants crossed themselves in silence. The nobles whispered behind doors, and the priests, those who had once blessed his madness as divine wrath, now trembled at the thought that he might be watching still, because Ivan's death did not feel like the end of a man. It felt like the beginning of a haunting. In the cathedral he built, the bells tolled for him at last. Their sound was heavy, slow, and uneven, as if the city itself struggled to remember how to mourn. Snow fell harder, covering domes and crosses alike. The color drained from the world, leaving only the shimmer of candlelight against stone. The people gathered in the square, staring up at the sky. They expected thunder, or fire, or some divine sign, but heaven remained silent. Only the wind answered, sweeping through the streets with a whisper like prayer or warning. The Tsar is gone. The Tsar remains. Inside the Kremlin, his servants prepared his body according to custom. They washed him with holy water, though the water turned faintly pink as it touched his skin. They dressed him in robes of crimson and gold, heavy as the sins they could not wash away. They placed a scepter in his right hand, a cross in his left, and laid him in a coffin carved from black oak. His face, at peace for the first time in decades, looked almost human. Almost. In that stillness, one could almost imagine he had been forgiven. But the walls remembered too much. The chambers whispered of screams. The corridors reeked of burned wax and fear. Every stone in the Kremlin seemed to exhale a long, cold breath. And somewhere in the rafters, a single raven landed and did not move again. The funeral stretched for days. All of Moscow attended, but no one wept openly. Grief and terror had long since become the same emotion here. The clergy spoke of salvation. The nobles spoke of legacy. But beneath their words, the truth lingered like frost. They were glad to see him go. Yet even in death, he ruled them. Every gesture, every glance, every word spoken in his presence now, his absence still carried the weight of his gaze. It was as if the empire itself feared to breathe without his permission. When the coffin was finally closed, the sound echoed through the cathedral like the sealing of fate. The people crossed themselves. The priests chanted the old words, "May his soul rest in peace." But peace had never been part of Ivan's kingdom. Outside, the sky turned the color of iron. A storm rose from the north, swallowing the city in snow. Wind howled against the cathedral spires, drowning out the prayers. It felt less like mourning, more like erasure, as though the world sought to bury not just a man, but a memory. Still, the body lay within, untouched by decay for days. Some said it was divine. Others whispered it was the devil's preservation, that even death feared to claim him. One monk, old and half-blind, claimed that in the night he saw light spilling from the coffin's seams. Not the light of heaven, something colder, harder, the pale blue of moonlit steel. He fled the cathedral before dawn and never returned. They buried Ivan beneath the floor of the Cathedral of the Archangel. The earth that received him was frozen solid. It took hours for the gravediggers to break through. Each strike of the shovel rang like a bell. When the coffin was lowered, one of them swore he felt the ground tremble. The priest told him it was only his fear. But years later, when storms passed over Moscow, that same ground was said to hum, a low metallic sound, like the murmur of a restless crown. Ivan Vasilievich, the first Tsar of all Russia, the man who had united a nation through fire and terror, now lay in silence. Above him, the domes of the Kremlin glowed in the stormlight green and gold fading into gray. Below him, in the deep black of earth, lay everything he had ever built, his empire, his faith, his damnation. And yet, even buried, his shadow did not end. It stretched across centuries through tsars and revolutions, through wars and ruins, as if the soil itself had absorbed his will and refused to forget. Because the truth was this: Ivan the Terrible never died. He became Russia itself. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. But the shadow of Ivan did not fade, it only changed shape. The Russia he forged in terror endured, its spine stiffened by fear, its heart scarred by obedience. No king, no emperor, no general could escape the echo of that name whispered beneath the golden domes of Moscow. Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Dread, Ivan the Terrible. Even now, his ghost seemed to sit beside every ruler who took the throne, invisible yet unyielding, his hand resting on their shoulder like frost. They said that when storms broke over the Kremlin, the bells would ring without human touch, that the great doors of the cathedral would groan open at midnight, and a figure cloaked in black would kneel before the altar. Some called it a priest. Others swore it was the Tsar himself, rising from the stone to count his sins again. The city learned to fear its own silence. Every shadow, every flicker of candlelight carried a story of him. Children grew up hearing his name like a spell, not of reverence, but of warning. "Don't anger the Tsar of blood," their mothers whispered. "His soul still walks when the snow falls red." Yet time is a strange kind of forgiveness. The same people who once trembled at his name began to call him the father of Russia. Historians wrote of his greatness, not his cruelty. Pain turned to myth, myth to pride. The terror that once shattered a nation became the foundation of its memory. His portrait hung beside saints. His cathedral still glowed in the twilight of Moscow. And beneath every victory Russia ever claimed, one could still feel the tremor of his voice, that cold conviction that only suffering could forge unity. Centuries later, when new tyrants rose, each with different flags, different tongues, but the same eyes, people said, "He has Ivan's soul." They were not wrong, for Ivan's legacy was not in monuments or marble, but in the belief that fear was order, that obedience was peace, that cruelty was strength. He had built not an empire of men, but an empire of ghosts, where every ruler wore his shadow as a crown. In the archives of Moscow, there is a letter, worn and yellow with time. It bears the seal of Ivan's own hand. In it, he wrote, "I have done what I must, for the sake of Russia. Let those who come after me judge me if they dare." The ink has faded, but the words have not. Every generation since has read them and fallen silent. Because to judge Ivan is to look into the mirror of power itself and realize that it stares back. In a monastery far north, where the wind carves the ice into spires and the sky bleeds violet at dusk, the monks still speak of him. They say that once every 100 years, when the aurora burns over the Kremlin, the snow turns crimson for a single night. It melts by morning, leaving no trace. But the ravens gather on the cathedral roof, as they did the day he died, waiting, watching, remembering. And so the legend endures. The Tsar, who ruled through terror, the man who turned his own madness into law, the believer who confused faith with fire. They say Russia itself was his final confession, a nation built to contain the soul of a man too vast, too broken, too divine to die. He was both sin and salvation, the builder and the destroyer, the father and the ghost. Now, in the frozen heart of Moscow, the Kremlin still stands red walls against a gray sky. Inside, the same corridors he once walked echo with footsteps of new rulers. Their faces change, their flags change, but somewhere, deep beneath the marble and gold, his shadow still moves, because power never dies. It only waits for a new name. If one listens closely in the winter wind that sweeps across Red Square, in the low hum of the cathedral bells, one might still hear him. A whisper beneath the sound of history, not asking for forgiveness, not offering it either, only reminding the world of one truth. To rule through fear is to live forever in it. In the archives of eternity, Ivan the Terrible's name remains carved between saint and monster. He was neither. He was both. A man who built a kingdom so vast that even death could not contain it. A ruler who became the mirror through which all despots would one day see themselves. A warning written not in ink, but in blood and ice. As the final snow falls over his tomb, the bells of Moscow toll once more, not in mourning, but in remembrance. And the voice of history, deep and weary, whispers through the storm. He united Russia through fear and divided its soul forever. The screen fades to black. Only the sound of wind remains. And then, softly the voice returns, solemn and eternal. This was Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar of blood, If you found power, cruelty, and history intertwining in the story of Ivan's soul, like, share, and subscribe. Because the past never dies. It only waits for us to remember.